Japan had a weapon capable of striking the United States in a way no one expected. These were underwater aircraft carriers with airplanes inside. The most frightening part of this story is not that this plan sounded like science fiction, but that it was real. During the Second World War, there was a rule that seemed unshakable. A submarine was supposed to hide under the water, move quietly, and wait for the right moment to strike. An aircraft carrier was supposed to remain on the surface, launch airplanes, and attack from the air. These were two different machines and two different logics of war. Military theorists, engineers, and naval officers were convinced that combining them was almost impossible. A submarine gains its advantage through stealth, a strong hull, and limited internal space. Airplanes require a hangar, fuel, maintenance, preparation time, and a safe launch. All of this went against the very nature of a submarine. Even early attempts to launch small aircraft from submarines only confirmed the problem rather than solving it. To release an airplane, the boat had to surface, open the hangar, prepare the aircraft, and remain on the surface longer than was acceptable in real combat. At that moment, the submarine lost its greatest advantage. It stopped being invisible. By the middle of the war, such an idea looked even more insane. Japan was already fighting a brutal struggle against the United States, losing ships, pilots, fuel, and time. In these conditions, building a huge submarine that was supposed to carry airplanes inside seemed not like boldness, but like an almost unforgivable luxury for a country being dragged deeper and deeper into a war of exhaustion. The Allies also did not expect such a move from Japan. American intelligence was watching the Japanese fleet closely, but the logic of the war suggested something else. Tokyo was expected to defend islands, transport cargo, carry out ordinary submarine attacks, and try to slow the advance. Almost no one seriously assumed that Japan would create an ocean-going submarine capable of carrying airplanes inside. This is exactly where the story begins that breaks the familiar picture of the Second World War. While most specialists considered this idea too complicated, too expensive, and too dangerous, Japanese engineers and naval command moved beyond talk. They did not argue over whether such a weapon could be created. They began building it. This was not a small experimental boat and not a technical demonstration. Japan laid down the giant I-400 class submarines. At that moment, they were the largest submarines in the world. Their size, range, and the design itself immediately showed that this was not a private engineering adventure, but an attempt to create a completely new instrument of war. Inside these boats, a sealed hangar was placed, designed to hold several airplanes. A catapult was set on the deck for rapid launch. The concept sounded almost unbelievable. The submarine crosses the Pacific in secret, surfaces near the target, releases its airplanes, and then disappears underwater again. This is no longer ordinary submarine warfare. It is an attempt to turn the ocean into a hidden launch platform. From this moment, the story changes. The question is no longer whether such a weapon was possible. The question is something else. If Japan really built underwater aircraft carriers for a strike against the United States, then how close did it come to a real attack? And it is right here that the next question appears. Who was supposed to take this giant boat across the ocean and carry this mad plan through to the end? Every secret operation has a person who must turn the idea into action. In the story of Japan's underwater aircraft carriers, that man becomes Tatsunosuke Ariizumi. Not an engineer, not an admiral, and not a politician, but a commander who is about to take on the most dangerous part of the entire plan and bring the secret boat to the point of attack. By the middle of the war, Ariizumi is no longer a young officer. He is an experienced sailor of the Imperial Japanese Navy, raised in a system where discipline and obedience to orders mean more than personal opinion. These are exactly the kind of men who become especially necessary in the last years of the war, when the fleet no longer needs debaters, but commanders ready to carry out an order at any cost. He stands at the center of this story not because he came up with the project of underwater aircraft carriers. His role is more dangerous. He has to accept an already finished plan and turn it into a real operation. That is where the main tension of his line lies. Ariizumi becomes not the author of a mad idea, but the man who must carry it across the ocean and bring it to its most dangerous stage. Under his command is the I-400. It is one of the largest submarines of its time and part of a project surrounded by strict secrecy even within the Japanese fleet. This submarine is built not only for stealthy movement and torpedo attack. Its mission is much broader. It must deliver airplanes across the ocean to a place where the enemy does not expect an attack at all. The command does not entrust Ariizumi with this mission by accident. It does not require just an experienced submariner. It requires a man capable of keeping a huge and complicated boat under control, maintaining iron discipline in the crew, and acting coldly in a situation where any mistake could ruin months of preparation. In such a mission, the price of a single minute and a single command becomes too high. His path is typical of a professional Japanese naval officer of that time. He is not a man of loud speeches and not a hero of posters. His world consists of watches, calculations, diving depth, routes, and precision of execution. But it is exactly such people who become the central figures in operations of desperation, when the fate of the mission depends not on slogans, but on endurance and professional cold blood. In Ariizumi, the two lines of this entire story come together. The first is connected with technology and a nearly unbelievable project that looks like a weapon from the future. The second is connected with Japan's late war, when even the boldest plans are born no longer from confidence, but from a lack of time. That is why his figure matters not only as the image of a commander, but also as a symbol of the Empire's final gamble. His mission sounds almost unbelievable, but that is exactly what it was. He must take the I-400 across the Pacific in maximum stealth, bring the boat into the operational area, prepare the airplanes for launch, and ensure a surprise strike against the Panama Canal. This is not a local attack, but an attempt to strike an object important to the entire American logistical system. For the United States, the Panama Canal means far too much to be treated as an ordinary target. It links two oceans and helps move forces quickly between theaters of war. If a strike against it succeeds, even temporary damage to the locks could produce not only material damage, but also a powerful psychological effect. That was exactly what the Japanese command was counting on. So Ariizumi becomes the central figure not because he achieves loud fame, but because the most dangerous part of the entire operation falls on his shoulders. He commands not just a submarine, but a weapon of last hope. And now, when we understand who exactly was supposed to lead this boat to its target, the next question appears. How was Japan planning to prepare such a strike at all, and how real was this mad plan? By this point, the war is already no longer going according to Japan's plan. The initiative is passing to the United States. The fleet is taking heavy losses. Industry is working under attack. The space for an ordinary victory is shrinking with every month. It is exactly in such a situation that the most dangerous ideas are born. Not as a sign of strength, but as a response to strategic desperation. Japan is no longer searching for a beautiful naval victory in the spirit of its pre-war doctrines. Now, it needs a strike that can disrupt the course of the war, at least for a while. Not necessarily a decisive one, but one that will force the enemy to look back, change plans, redeploy forces, and feel that even across immense distances, it is no longer completely safe. That is how a concept appears that for a long time was seen almost as a legend. If Japan can no longer force the enemy into battle on favorable terms, then it must strike where no one expects a blow, not along the front line, not against an individual squadron, but against a target whose destruction would be felt far beyond one raid and one point on the map. That target becomes the Panama Canal. For the United States, this means far more than just a complicated engineering structure. It is the key to rapid movement between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It is the artery through which forces can be shifted faster, formations can be changed, and the tempo of war can be maintained across enormous distances. A strike against it promises not only damage, but shock. The Japanese calculation is built not on the vulnerability of America as territory, but on the vulnerability of its military logistics. If the canal locks are damaged, even temporarily, the consequences could be serious. Ship transfers would become more difficult. Routes would grow longer. But another effect matters just as much. The very fact of such an attack would show that even the distant American rear no longer looked unreachable. For such an operation to become possible at all, a carrier is needed that can do what no ordinary submarine can do. It must cross an enormous distance through the ocean without revealing itself, without losing combat effectiveness, and without requiring support. It must not simply approach the target, but do so in such a way that the enemy does not understand until the very last moment where the blow is coming from. That is how the Sentoku class is born, including the I-400 and the I-401. These are no longer just large submarines. They are special ocean platforms designed for the secret transfer of an airstrike across thousands of miles of water. Their size is astonishing even on paper. Until the appearance of nuclear submarines, they remain the largest submarines in the world of their time. The design of these boats is built around one mission that the very nature of submarine warfare seems to forbid. In the central part of the hull, a sealed cylindrical hangar is installed. Inside it, airplanes are supposed to be protected from seawater and kept ready for rapid preparation. A catapult is installed on the deck so that, after surfacing, launch does not turn into a long and fatally dangerous procedure. For this mission, a special aircraft is also created. This is the Aichi M6A Seiran. Not a normal carrier aircraft and not a standard bomber, but an airplane for an extremely unusual task. It has to be stored in limited space, rolled out quickly, assembled, armed, and launched by catapult in the middle of the ocean, where every extra minute can cost the entire operation. In theory, the sequence looks almost flawless. The submarine moves in secret across the Pacific. Near the target, it surfaces. The crew opens the hangar. The airplanes are brought out, their wings and tail surfaces are unfolded, weapons are attached, and one by one they are sent into the sky. Then the submarine dives again, leaving the enemy only the consequences of the strike and the question of where it even came from. But between this sequence and reality lies an enormous gap. Every stage requires absolute precision. Any delay on deck wastes precious time in the open. Any technical malfunction ruins the launch. Any mistake in coordination turns the secret boat into a large, slow, vulnerable target in the middle of the ocean, where there is no hope of help. Not only submariners are involved in the preparation, but also pilots, mechanics, navigation officers, and aircraft maintenance specialists. This operation requires not ordinary naval training, but almost surgical coordination. Every man must know his place, his sequence of actions, and the price of every second, because it is seconds that decide whether the boat remains unnoticed or is detected. The I-400 and the I-401 become the core of this project. They must carry the entire concept, both literally and strategically. These are no longer just warships, but carriers of a single idea. A secret airstrike delivered across the ocean from beneath the water. For the Japanese fleet, this is not a secondary measure, but a gamble on a weapon of exceptional character. Secrecy around the project is absolute. The narrower the room for maneuver in the war itself becomes, the more tightly the command clings to the element of surprise. If the United States learns in advance that such boats exist and understands why they are being built, the whole idea loses its greatest advantage. That is why the future strike must remain unbelievable right up to the moment it begins. It is right here that the figure of Ariizumi and his crew returns to the center of the preparation. They are expected not simply to command a huge boat, but to make the impossible routine. For them, the mad project stops being a diagram on a staff map. It becomes a route, watches, technical inspections, hidden movement across the ocean, and readiness to surface right beside the target. And yet beneath the outward precision of this preparation, the nerve of the late war can already be felt. Japan is creating a weapon that truly seems ahead of its time, but doing so at the very moment when it is almost out of time. And the closer the boats move toward their mission, the sharper the central question becomes. Will this project manage to become a real strike, or will the war outrun it before it has the chance to speak? But it is exactly here that something enters the story that breaks even the boldest calculations. While engineers and crews rehearse their actions, the war itself is changing faster than the secret weapons of attack can be built and deployed. The project, conceived as a weapon of strategic shock, collides with a reality in which Japan is already losing not individual positions, but the very tempo of the war. By 1945, the position of the empire is deteriorating rapidly. American superiority at sea and in the air is becoming overwhelming. Japanese communications are collapsing. Fuel is running short. Experienced pilots are gone. The fleet can no longer operate with its former freedom. Under these conditions, even the boldest operation begins to depend not only on technology, but on time, and almost no time remains. Time itself becomes the main enemy of the I-400 project. The submarines exist, the airplanes exist, preparation is underway. But any such system has value only when the country is still able to fit it into the overall strategy of the war. Japan is approaching the point where it still has dangerous individual tools, but almost no room left in which they can produce a decisive effect. The original plan against the Panama Canal looks logical as a strike against logistics and against the enemy's psychology. But the closer the war moves to its end, the harder it becomes to understand whether even a successful attack would change anything truly important. By that time, the United States possesses such an overwhelming industrial and military superiority that one bold strike can no longer alter the overall balance of power. This does not make the plan any less dangerous. On the contrary, in a local sense, it remains alarming and very real. Damage to the locks of the Panama Canal could have created a serious shock and disrupted the normal rhythm of force movements. But the strategic picture is already too heavy for Japan. Even success begins to look less like a path to reversal and more like an attempt to deliver one loud blow before the inevitable end. And this is where the operation itself begins to be reconsidered. As Japan's position worsens, the command is forced to think not only about effect, but also about urgency. The Panama Canal remains an attractive target, but another question grows louder. Does Japan have the luxury of waiting and preparing such a complicated strike when the war is already approaching the most important nerve centers of the empire? It is in this atmosphere that attention begins to shift. Instead of a distant strike against Panama, a target connected with direct pressure on American forces in the Pacific becomes more urgent. Among the options under consideration appears Ulithi, an important anchorage of the American fleet, turned by the Allies into a powerful operational base in the Central Pacific. This decision says more about Japan's real condition in the last months of the war than any loud declarations. The secret weapon that had been conceived as a means of shaking the global logic of the conflict is being drawn more and more into tasks dictated by an immediate military crisis. A project of the future begins to serve a present that is already cracking apart. For Ariazumi and his men, this means not an abstract correction of plans, but a direct change in the meaning of the voyage. Their boat is no longer moving toward a single fixed scenario. Now a sense of instability hangs over the mission. The target can change, priorities can change, and the war itself seems to outrun the decisions being made at headquarters. Inside such an operation, this is especially dangerous. A secret weapon demands precision not only in execution, but also in conception. When the target and the overall context begin to shift, a crack runs through the whole project. The submarine, the airplanes, the route, and the crew's preparation were all built around a certain logic of surprise attack. But the further this goes, the more it seems that the plan itself is starting to fall apart before it even begins. And yet, the preparation continues. Because Japan has almost no other choice left. To abandon it would mean admitting that even its most secret and most expensive weapon had become useless without delivering a single strike. That is why the project is pushed forward, even though its historical window is rapidly narrowing. The war seems to offer it a chance, and at the same time takes away the time needed for that chance. At this stage, the story of the underwater aircraft carriers completely ceases to be a story of brilliant engineering audacity. It becomes a story about the mismatch between technology and the moment. Japan truly creates the impossible. But it does so when even the impossible is no longer capable of restoring control over events. The stronger the project itself appears, the more tragic its lateness becomes. That is why defeat begins to be felt even before the final collapse of the operation. Not because the boats are incapable of carrying out the mission, but because the strategic environment itself is no longer favorable to them. They are too complex, too valuable, and too late. This is a weapon that looks terrifying technically, but fits worse and worse into a world where Japan is already losing the ability to dictate the course of the war. This is how the central tension of this part of the story is born. The underwater aircraft carriers do not turn out to be a myth. They are not abandoned as a mad fantasy. They exist, they are ready, they are moving toward their mission. But as the project approaches possible use, something else becomes clear. Its creators managed to defeat engineering, but they did not manage to defeat time. And it is right here that the story reaches its most dangerous turning point. By the summer of 1945, this story reaches its strangest and darkest point. Everything that only recently looked like an incredible but real strike plan is now hanging over an abyss. The submarines exist. The crews are ready. The airplanes have been built. The secret operation is almost mature enough to be carried out. But the war itself is already moving faster than this weapon can keep up. In such a situation, the crisis does not arrive in the form of one accident or one combat clash. It arrives as a slow suffocation of the plan. Everything that made the I-400 project terrifying and unique also made it extremely fragile. Preparation is too complicated. The journey is too long. The cost of every mistake is too high. And there is too little time left for a country already standing on the edge of defeat. For the crews, this means living in a state of constant ожидание. An order can come at any moment. The target can change. A voyage prepared as a historic operation can turn at any minute into a ruined mission without a single strike. The tension here is born not from the battle itself, but from the understanding that everything around them is collapsing faster than the boat can reach its decisive line. This is exactly what defines the final stage of the operation. They have reached the threshold at which the submarine is almost becoming the instrument of the boldest design of Japan's late war. And at that moment, it becomes clear that the threat does not come only from the Americans, not only from the ocean, and not only from possible detection. It comes from the course of history itself. Japan is already living in a state of collapse. Losses are growing. Cities are being hit by devastating air raids. The naval power of the empire is running out. In such circumstances, even a unique weapon begins to sound like a final argument that will not reach the right moment in time. It is still capable of striking, but the country that created it is already losing the ability to turn that strike into a strategic result. And yet, it is precisely now that the project reaches its highest point of tension. The submarines have not yet been destroyed. The order has not yet been finally cancelled. The possibility of a strike still remains in theory. That is what makes the story so disturbing. This is not about a fantasy that was never realized. It is about a system that truly came right up to the moment when secrecy could have turned into action. Then an event arrives that cuts the whole plan off in a single movement. Japan capitulates. In one moment, everything changes. The operation into which resources, months of preparation, and rare engineering audacity had been poured turns not into a raid, but into a cancelled mission. From that moment on, the underwater aircraft carriers stop being weapons of the future and become witnesses to the end of the empire. For the crews, this means an order that is the complete opposite of everything they had been prepared for. Do not attack. Do not bring the airplanes out for launch. Do not strike the target. Instead, stop, destroy sensitive documents, get rid of anything that could reveal the details of the operation, and prepare to surrender. It is one of the sharpest turns in the whole story. A weapon created for a surprise strike falls silent before its first strategic shot. At that moment, not only the operation disappears, but also the possibility of ever knowing how it might have ended. That is why the story of the I-400 is so deeply surrounded by a sense of mystery. We can see a project that was real. We can see the submarines, the airplanes, the crews, the route, the target, and the preparation. But the final step remains behind the veil of an action that never took place, and that makes the investigation even more disturbing. When the Americans gain access to the Japanese submarines, they quickly understand that these are not merely unusual trophies. This is a technology that could have opened a new direction in naval warfare. Enormous range, stealthy approach, a hangar with airplanes, catapult launch. All of this looks not like an exotic curiosity, but like an early image of another era in which strategic strike capability is moved underwater. An urgent study of the captured boats begins, along with their design, internal layout, and Seiran aircraft. The victors look at this project no longer as a curiosity of a defeated enemy, but as a real military asset. And here the story makes another turn. The question no longer sounds like why Japan failed to attack in time. The question sounds different. Why did these boats disappear from sight so quickly after the war? The answer lies in a new political reality. The war ends, but almost immediately another tension rises in its place between former allies. The United States does not want the technologies of the underwater aircraft carriers, their design solutions, and the very logic of long-range hidden strike to fall into Soviet hands. What had been Japanese secret weaponry the day before is now becoming an American secret. That is why the story of the I-400 does not receive a loud post-war continuation. It is not turned into a public symbol of a mad Japanese experiment. On the contrary, much is done to remove these boats as quickly as possible from future disputes over trophies and technology. In the end, part of the captured submarines are later sunk. And so the project that was supposed to emerge from the darkness of the ocean disappears back into the depths. And here the crisis reaches its final and almost symbolic ending. The underwater aircraft carriers do not die in a decisive battle. They do not burn in attack and do not become the heroes of a loud operation. Their fate is much quieter and because of that, more frightening. They are too late for Japan's victory and too valuable for the victors to allow them to remain visible. That is why the final phase of this story feels not like an ordinary military ending, but like the closing of a classified file. Japan creates the impossible. It approaches actual use. It fails to make it in time. It capitulates. The victor studies the project and hurries to remove it from the visible surface of history. And when it all ends, the heaviest thought remains. One of the boldest weapons of the Second World War did not fail as a myth. It disappeared as a dangerous truth that people preferred not to notice for far too long. Directly, the I-400 underwater aircraft carriers no longer have time to change the course of the war. They do not strike the Panama Canal, do not disrupt American logistics, and do not become the weapon of revenge that Tokyo might have hoped for in its most desperate months. But that does not make the project insignificant. On the contrary, its consequences turn out to be deeper than the result of one cancelled operation. The very existence of these boats changes the understanding of the limits of naval warfare. Before this, a submarine is associated above all with torpedo attack, stealthy pursuit of convoys, and hunting ships. The I-400 shows another possibility. A submarine can be not only a killer in the depths, but also a carrier of a long-range surprise strike against a distant strategic target. This is especially important because the project appears not as a theoretical dream, but as a system almost brought to the point of use. Real boats were built, real aircraft were created, real crews were trained. In other words, the idea did not remain at the level of drawings. Japan proved that even in the conditions of a late war, it was possible to create a weapon that combined the stealth of the submarine fleet with the range of an airstrike. For the Japanese command, such boats become a symbol of the last hope for an unconventional answer to American superiority. When ordinary naval strategy collapses, solutions built not on equal struggle but on surprise begin to take center stage. In this sense, the I-400 is not just an exotic project, but an expression of the entire logic of late Japanese warfare, where the gamble is increasingly placed on one sharp and psychologically powerful strike. For the United States, the meaning of these boats is different, but no less serious. American military leaders quickly understand that what stands before them is not merely a bizarre piece of technology from a defeated enemy. They see a platform that opens a new line in naval thinking. Stealthy approach, long range, strike against distant infrastructure, and surprise against an enemy that may not be ready for it. That is why the story of the I-400 matters not only as an episode of the Second World War, but also as a premonition of future doctrines. Later, the world would see submarines as carriers of strategic weapons, capable of approaching secretly to the required distance and delivering a strike across enormous range. In this sense, the Japanese project turns out to be not a dead-end anomaly, but an early and very accurate forerunner of a new era. Of course, it is important here not to exaggerate. Even if the strike against the Panama Canal had taken place and succeeded, it would hardly have changed the outcome of the war completely. The industrial power of the United States, the scale of its fleet, and its overall superiority by that point were simply too great. But strategic effect is not always measured only by the number of ships sunk or the amount of direct damage inflicted. Sometimes, the very fact of a sudden strike where no one expected it can be just as powerful. That was exactly the danger of the Japanese plan. If the underwater aircraft carriers had managed to strike the Panama Canal or another important target, the shock would have been enormous. The Americans would have had to urgently rethink the security of their own rear and begin searching for threats where they had barely seen any before. There is another consequence as well, one that is rarely spoken of directly. The I-400 project shows how quickly war can push technology forward when familiar methods no longer work. In peacetime, the idea of an underwater aircraft carrier might have seemed too expensive, too complicated, and too risky. But in the conditions of total conflict, states move towards such experiments because the price of doing nothing begins to seem even higher. That is where the heaviest truth of the project lies. It was born not only from engineering boldness, but also from strategic desperation. Japan did not build the I-400 out of abundant resources or confidence in victory. It built these boats because the war demanded the impossible. And yet it is exactly in such an almost hopeless situation that a machine appears which is years ahead of its time and forces the victors to study it carefully. That is why the consequences of the I-400 story reach far beyond one cancelled strike. These boats did not change the Second World War directly, but they changed the very language in which submarine warfare could be discussed. They proved that the boundaries between sea, air, and hidden strategic strike had already begun to blur. And that means that even a project that arrived too late can leave behind a much longer shadow than any completed operation. And it is right here that the story makes one more important turn. The clearer the project's significance for future military thought becomes, the sharper the final question sounds. What happened to the men who were entrusted with this weapon, and why did the history of these underwater aircraft carriers fade into the shadows so quickly after the war ended? Stories like this almost never have a loud epilogue. They do not end with a parade, official glory, or a place in textbooks. The story of Japan's underwater aircraft carriers passes into the post-war darkness almost the same way it began. Under a cover of secrecy, among destroyed documents, interrogations, silence, and the rapidly disappearing traces of one of the boldest operations of the entire war. The fate of Tatsunosuke Ariizumi makes this ending even heavier. After the capitulation, he can no longer remain simply the commander of a secret submarine waiting for a new order. The world for which his professional code had been built is collapsing before his eyes. The empire has lost. The operation is cancelled. The weapon to which he devoted himself did not become a strike, but a trophy of the victor. According to available accounts, after the surrender of the Fur 400, Ariizumi took his own life. In this single detail lies the entire tragedy of Japan's late war. A man entrusted with one of the most unusual and dangerous missions of the Imperial Japanese Navy did not enter the post-war age as a participant in a new world. He remained part of a system that disappeared together with Japan's defeat and together with the strike that never took place. In a certain sense, his personal fate repeats the fate of the project itself. Both Ariizumi and the I-400 were created for a decisive action that never happened. They were not remembered as victors. They were not seen at the moment of triumph. They seem suspended between two eras, too late for one war and too dangerous to pass quietly into the post-war world without an attempt to hide their significance. Almost the same thing happens to the submarines themselves. The Americans capture them, study them, evaluate the design, the hangar, the catapult system, the aircraft, and the overall logic of a long-range hidden strike. But instead of a loud museum future or a broad public display, the project quickly disappears into the shadows. Another struggle begins. Not between Japan and the United States, but between yesterday's allies in a world entering the Cold War. That is exactly why some of the captured submarines are later sunk so that their technology will not fall into Soviet hands. That single step says a great deal. The victors did not treat the I-400 as a strange toy of a defeated power. They considered the project serious enough to hide it from a new rival. The underwater aircraft carriers did not become a loud symbol of Japanese defeat. They became dangerous knowledge that was deliberately sent back under the water. And from that comes the central paradox of the whole story. People speak little about the I-400 boats not because they never existed or because they meant nothing. On the contrary, they were spoken of so little for so long precisely because they were too real, too unusual, and too clearly demonstrated just how far war can push military thought when familiar boundaries stop working. Today, this story matters not only as a rare episode of the Second World War, it matters as a reminder that the most astonishing technologies do not necessarily emerge from the victors and do not necessarily appear on time. Sometimes a weapon of the future appears in the hands of a state that is already losing. It can be ahead of its era, yet arrive too late for its own moment. And then it remains not as a triumph, but as the ghost of a possibility that never came to pass. The I-400 is not just an exotic submarine with airplanes inside. It is an early image of a new logic of war. Stealth, enormous range, suddenness, and a strike against a distant target without direct warning. Everything that would later become one of the foundations of strategic thinking is already present here in embryonic form. That is why the project looks not like a curiosity, but like the shadow of future wars that appeared both too early and too late at the same time. And perhaps this is the strongest conclusion of the whole story. Japan did not manage to use its underwater aircraft carriers the way it had planned. They did not strike the Panama Canal, and they did not change the course of the war. But the very fact that such machines were built prepared, and brought almost to the point of use, forces us to look differently at the end of the Second World War. Even at the moment of defeat, one nation was still trying to attack the future.